It was one of those unusually quiet Saturday mornings, the kind that made the chaos of the world feel like a distant memory. Birds chirped lazily from the oak trees lining our street, and the sun filtered through the blinds in golden streaks that warmed the hardwood floors beneath my feet. My coffee was still hot, untouched, resting on the windowsill as I watched my son navigate our small front yard in his wheelchair. He just turned 10 last week, and despite the odds he was born with, he was the happiest kid on the block. His laughter carried through the crisp air like a song, unbothered by the limits his body placed on him. I had taken an early retirement from active duty SWAT rotations to spend more time with him. After years of tactical operations and adrenaline-fueled missions, this quiet life was something I had earned, and something I would protect at all costs. We moved into this neighborhood hoping for peace. It was supposed to be safe, close-knit and welcoming, a place where families knew each other by name. But it didn't take long for us to realize we'd made a critical miscalculation. Every street has its shadows, and ours took the form of the HOA president, a woman named Karen who ran the neighborhood like her own personal kingdom. From the moment we moved in, she treated our family like an inconvenience, scrutinizing every minor detail, from our mailbox paint to the type of plants in our yard. Still, we stayed respectful. I kept my head down, smiled when it was polite to, and reminded myself that some battles weren't worth fighting. At least, that's what I thought. Until the day she did the unthinkable. Until the day she pinned my son under her SUV and dared to call it an accident. Karen made her first real move on a sunny afternoon, not long after we finished building a small accessibility ramp at the front of our house. My son loved being outside, and that ramp gave him just enough independence to roll down into the driveway without needing me to lift him every time. I remember standing beside the mailbox, adjusting a new set of house numbers, when I heard the sharp click of heels on pavement and the unmistakable throat clearing that signaled her arrival. She stood there with a clipboard in one hand and a phone in the other, her oversized sunglasses reflecting the sunlight like twin interrogation lamps. Without so much as a greeting, she launched into a tirade about the unauthorized structure we'd installed. I calmly explained it was an accessibility ramp for my disabled son, built well within the guidelines and setback rules listed in the HOA bylaws. But she wasn't interested in logic. Her voice dripped with fake concern as she lectured me about aesthetic uniformity and how other residents might feel if exceptions were made. It wasn't about rules, it was about power, control. And for some reason, we had become her new target. Over the next few days, the notices began piling up. Letters citing imaginary violations, our trash bins being too visible from the street, our grass being a half-inch too high, a tiny garden gnome my son adored being labelled visual clutter. Each time, I responded respectfully, providing documentation or making small adjustments where necessary. I had been in far more hostile situations than this, and I wasn't about to let a bored suburban enforcer shake me. But it didn't stop. Karen escalated things by threatening fines and bringing up legal jargon she clearly didn't understand. Neighbors whispered about her antics, but no one dared challenge her directly. That's when I realized we weren't just dealing with an annoying neighbor. We were dealing with someone who thrived on intimidation. And worse, someone who saw my son's disability not as something to accommodate, but as an inconvenience. That realization changed everything. My instincts sharpened. I'd handled hostage negotiations, drug raids, and cartel stings, but nothing prepared me for the cold malice hiding behind Karen's polite smile and pastel-colored sweaters. The day it happened started like any other. The sky was a pale shade of blue, washed out by the rising heat, and the neighborhood was unusually still. My son had asked to go outside to adjust the flag he'd proudly hung on his wheelchair, an old SWAT patch I'd given him, the kind of thing that made him feel connected to me, to strength. I was inside grabbing a refill of lemonade, when I heard the sound of tires screeching far too fast for a residential street. My blood froze. That sound was wrong. A hard, angry growl of an engine revving too quickly, paired with the kind of panic that made my instincts scream before my brain had a chance to catch up. I bolted out the front door. What I saw will haunt me for the rest of my life. My son was halfway down the ramp, smiling, flag fluttering beside him. Karen's white SUV, the one with the HOA proud sticker, crookedly slapped on the back window, came barreling around the corner. She wasn't braking. She wasn't even looking. One hand was on the wheel, the other raised in the air. She was yelling into her Bluetooth earpiece. By the time she saw him, it was too late. Her eyes widened. She jerked the wheel, but the right front tire struck the wheelchair's corner and sent it twisting. The impact knocked him sideways, and the wheelchair collapsed beneath the SUV's bumper. The front of the vehicle surged forward, trapping his small frame beneath the weight of her front axle. The sound he made, it wasn't a scream. It was this sharp, guttural gasp that didn't sound human, like all the air had been punched out of his lungs. I was already running full speed, my voice ripping through the air, ordering her to stop, to get out of the damn car. She froze, hands shaking, face ghost pale, as she slowly opened the door and stumbled out. I dropped to my knees next to the vehicle. My son's legs were pinned awkwardly beneath the frame, one twisted at a sickening angle. His hands trembled as he tried to push himself free, face contorted in pain. I didn't have time to panic. My training kicked in. I assessed the injury, kept him still, whispered to him over and over that I was there, that help was coming. My hands were steady, but my heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might break my ribs from the inside out. Karen stood a few feet away, eyes wide, one hand pressed against her mouth in faux shock. But then she said it. The words that shifted my anger into something deeper, darker. She said, "Why was he in the way?" I didn't see him. He should have known better than to be in the driveway. I stared at her, unblinking, feeling my jaw tighten so hard I could hear the grind of my own teeth. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw her onto the pavement and make her feel what my son was feeling. But I couldn't. Not yet. The ambulance arrived within minutes, sirens piercing through the silence like a blade. Paramedics swarmed, lifting him carefully, strapping him to a gurney. One of the officers recognized me and gave me a silent nod of respect. Karen tried to speak to them, hands flailing, blaming the sun, the angle, his wheelchair, anything but her own negligence. But I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was staring at the red streak on the pavement, at the broken wheel lying in the grass, at my son's pale face disappearing into the back of the ambulance. And in that moment, I knew exactly what needed to be done. The ride to the hospital was quiet except for the beeping of monitors and the occasional whisper from the paramedic checking my son's vitals. He was conscious but barely responsive, drifting in and out with a pained expression that tore at every fiber of my being. I sat beside him, gripping his hand, holding back the storm boiling just beneath the surface. I had seen violence. I had faced down armed criminals, but nothing in my career had ever made me feel this helpless. This wasn't just a mission gone sideways. This was my boy, crushed under the weight of a woman's arrogance. Doctors moved quickly once we arrived. Broken arm, fractured ribs, bruising down his side from the pressure of the SUV. The orthopedic surgeon told me we were lucky, a few inches either way, and we might have been looking at spinal damage, or worse. I stood there, nodding, thanking them, but inside I was on fire. The image of his small frame caught under that car looped in my mind like a curse, and every time it ended with her face, Karen, that mask of condescension she wore even in the aftermath, as if she had been the victim. Hours later, I returned home to find a police officer waiting. He handed me an incident report. Thin, vague, procedural. Karen had told them she was distracted, said the sun was in her eyes, said my son had darted into the driveway. The lies were so brittle they barely held together. But still, the officer had written it all down with clinical detachment. I asked if charges were being filed. He sighed, said it would likely be treated as a civil matter unless something more substantial came up. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply nodded, thanked him, and shut the door behind me. Then I stood there, alone in my kitchen, staring at the cold tile floor, as silence settled like a shroud. I was trained to stay calm under pressure, to calculate, to wait. And now, more than ever, I would need that control. Because this wasn't just about injury or negligence anymore. This was personal. And Karen didn't realize that the quiet father she thought she could intimidate had spent his life breaking down doors for a living. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. To her, I was just another suburban dad, a quiet man with a disabled son, and a modest house at the end of the cul-de-sac. She didn't know about the years I spent in tactical gear, the missions overseas, or the dozens of operations I'd led where hesitation could mean death. She saw only what she wanted to see, someone she could bully, someone who wouldn't fight back. That was her first mistake. As my son recovered in the hospital, I set a plan in motion. I wasn't going to scream or post on social media. I wasn't going to show up at her house and threaten her. No, I was going to gather facts, build a case, and bury her under the weight of her own actions. I started with the obvious. I pulled the footage from my doorbell camera and our 2 exterior security cams. What I found made my stomach turn. Clear video of her SUV swerving into our driveway, never slowing down, her eyes on her phone, not the road. My son hadn't moved into her path. He'd been exactly where he was supposed to be. Next, I knocked on doors, quietly, respectfully. I asked neighbors if they'd ever had run-ins with Karen. It was like opening a floodgate. Stories poured out, threatening letters, lawn nitpicks, unapproved driveway colors, fines for holiday decorations. One elderly couple admitted they'd stopped decorating for Christmas altogether just to avoid her wrath. I took notes, got statements, and built a file. Then I went deeper. Using contacts from my years on the force, I accessed public complaints filed against the HOA. I discovered Karen had been named in multiple grievances over the past 5 years, some dismissed, some ignored. But they painted a clear pattern: abuse of power, intimidation, selective enforcement. Everything pointed to a woman who believed she was above the rules she claimed to uphold. What she didn't realize was that I had spent a career reading people under pressure, uncovering lies, and piecing together truth from chaos. And this time, I wasn't doing it for a paycheck. I was doing it for my son. Karen thought she'd hit a speed bump. She didn't know she'd just ignited the instincts of a man trained to finish what others start. The days that followed were long and heavy, each hour stretching out like a slow burn. My son lay in a hospital bed, bruised and bandaged, still trying to smile through the pain. Every time he winced or struggled to lift his arm, the fire inside me burned hotter. But I didn't let it consume me. I stayed by his side during the day, whispering encouragement and reading him stories. At night, when the halls of the hospital went quiet, I sharpened the blade of my resolve. Karen had no idea the kind of patience I had cultivated over decades of training. In tactical work, you learn to wait. You learn to observe, to measure every breath of your target before making a move. This was no different. The HOA had tried to sweep it under the rug, sending out a bland neighborhood memo about an unfortunate incident and urging residents to respect one another's privacy. There was no mention of the injuries, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, just a sanitized version of reality meant to protect one of their own. but I wasn't going to let it die in silence. I contacted a civil rights attorney, someone with a reputation for precision and fire. I handed her the footage, the statements, the history. She didn't blink. "We'll take it all the way," she said, and I believed her. At the same time, I made some calls to trusted friends still active in law enforcement, not to pull favors, just to make sure the facts were seen by the right eyes. Slowly, quietly, the tide began to turn. The incident was no longer just an accident buried in paperwork. It was being re-examined, reconsidered, reclassified. The pressure mounted. Then the call came. An emergency HOA board meeting had been scheduled. Mandatory attendance. Karen was going to be there, of course, likely expecting nothing more than another opportunity to defend herself in her usual smug tone. But what she didn't know was that this time, the room wouldn't belong to her. I would walk in with everything. The truth, the evidence, and a quiet, commanding presence she never imagined I had. It was no longer about confrontation. It was about exposure. And the moment she saw me walk through those doors, she would finally understand the consequences of picking the wrong man to push. The room was already half full when I arrived, murmurs bouncing off the HOA clubhouse walls like low thunder. Folding chairs lined up in neat rows, residents clustered in uneasy circles, unsure of what the meeting was truly about. Karen stood at the front, smiling tightly, clipboard in hand, pretending this was just another procedural update. She wore a floral blouse and pearl earrings, the same costume of civility she always donned when she wanted to look untouchable. But there was a flicker of discomfort in her eyes when she saw me walk in. I didn't come in shouting. I didn't make a scene. I walked straight to the front and handed a folder to the board's secretary. Inside were printed statements from neighbors, photographs of my son's injuries, timestamps, and high-resolution screenshots from my security cameras. The footage itself had already been shared, anonymously at first, with a few concerned residents and, more importantly, with the local news desk. I wasn't seeking headlines. I was seeking accountability. But I knew what would happen once the truth was too heavy to ignore. Karen's voice wavered as she tried to keep the meeting on track. She called the incident unfortunate, claimed it had been addressed appropriately, and insisted no violations had occurred. That's when I spoke. I calmly addressed the crowd, introducing myself not as a former SWAT commander, but simply as a father. I described what had happened in plain terms, without embellishment. Then I played the video. Gasps echoed. A few people covered their mouths. Karen's face went blank, then flushed. She tried to interrupt, but no one was listening to her anymore. The images spoke louder than her excuses ever could. By the end of the meeting, the room had turned. Neighbors who once kept quiet were now angry, at the lies, at the abuse of power, at the silence they'd been forced to swallow for years. Calls for Karen's resignation echoed through the room. A vote was demanded. The board, under mounting pressure, suspended her pending a formal investigation. She stood frozen, trembling in place. For the first time, her voice failed her. She realized she wasn't in control anymore. The mask had cracked, and she knew, finally, that she wasn't walking away from this one. The fallout came faster than even I expected. Within 48 hours of the meeting, Karen was no longer HOA president. The board released a statement calling her actions incompatible with the values of our community and distanced themselves with the kind of urgency reserved for sinking ships. But that was only the beginning. The local news station aired the footage during their evening broadcast, pairing it with a chilling voiceover about negligence and unchecked authority. Karen's SUV, her face, her name, they were all over the screen. There was no hiding now. The police department, under pressure from both public scrutiny and internal review, reopened the case. This time, they didn't treat it like a fender bender. With the evidence I'd provided, surveillance footage, medical reports, and witness statements, they classified it as felony reckless endangerment, with potential for aggravated assault due to the victim being a minor with a disability. Karen was arrested at her home. She cried and begged, tried to tell the officers it was all a misunderstanding, that she was a good person, but it didn't matter. The cuffs went on. My lawyer filed a civil suit the same week, seeking damages for medical expenses, trauma, and emotional distress. We weren't doing it for the money. We were doing it to set a precedent, so that the next family Karen or someone like her tried to bully would know they had a voice, and that voice mattered. In the end, the entire HOA board stepped down. A new committee was formed, one made up of actual neighbors who wanted to make the community better, not rule it like a petty dictatorship. People who once kept their heads down started waving when they passed by. Some brought meals, others slipped cards into our mailbox. It didn't erase what happened, but it was something. I never once raised my voice at Karen, never threatened her, never needed to. I let the truth do the talking. Tactical precision, patience, pressure. That's how I was trained. And in the end, it worked. Karen learned too late that not every man who stays quiet is weak. Some are just waiting for the perfect moment to strike, with discipline, with purpose, and with justice that lands harder than any fist ever could. My son came home 2 weeks later, his arm in a cast, bruises fading into shades of yellow and brown. He still smiled, still laughed, still asked me to race him in his wheelchair across the driveway. That same driveway where everything changed. I watched him, this small, resilient soul who'd been through more pain than most grown men, and I felt something shift inside me. Not rage anymore, not even vengeance. Just a deep, steady conviction. This world isn't fair. It never has been. But that doesn't mean we let the bullies win. It doesn't mean we stand down when those we love are hurt. I've spent years training for combat, for chaos, for danger in every form, but nothing prepares you for the kind of quiet hurt that comes when someone tries to crush your family under the weight of their arrogance. And nothing makes you stronger than the moment you decide to stand back up and fight with everything you've got. Karen thought she was above consequences, that her position gave her power. But real power doesn't come from a title or a clipboard. It comes from standing your ground, from protecting the people who can't protect themselves, from doing what's right when it would be easier to look the other way. I didn't just fight for justice. I fought for peace. For the kind of peace my son deserves to feel every time he rolls into the sun without fear. For every family that's been told to stay quiet, to accept, to move on. Number not anymore. I won't always be able to shield him from the world, but I can make damn sure the world knows he's not alone. And anyone who thinks they can break that bond will find out the hard way what a father's mission really looks like.